¿Qué tal amigos? Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Hoy soy muy afortunado de tener a Dereck Rae conmigo acá en esta entrevista. Él es un comentarista de fútbol con más de 30 años de experiencia y ustedes lo pueden conocer por el juego de FIFA, de FIFA 19. Es parte de este juego, primero como la Champions League, en este momento ya como el relator oficial del juego. Y aquí está conmigo, Mr. Rae. Thank you for joining me. I'm very happy to have you here with me today.
Thank you very much, Jose Mario. Muchas gracias para la invitación. No hablo muchas palabras de español, pero entiendo. Sí, es una ventaja. Poquito español entiendo. So, yeah, there we go.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you very much. Okay, a lot of people in here might know you by the game, the FIFA 21, 2019 yes. game, but you've been calling football games for more than 30 years. Tell us, who's Dereck Rae?
Well, I'm from Scotland, from Escocia, and very proud to be from Scotland. And I began commentating on an amateur basis at a very young age. When I was 7 in 1974, when the World Cup was happening in West Germany, I began to record myself. We had just bought our very first recording device in our home in Aberdeen in Scotland. And from that point on, I really would record just about everything on the street, in the park, at school, and eventually to hospital radio I would go. And that's an amateur setup that we have in Scotland, where we provide a radio service for people who are unfortunately in hospital. And so football has always been part of my life. German language is a big part of my life as well. It was my best subject at school, and I sort of combined that with my football interest too, and would listen a lot to German radio as a youngster. I mentioned I'm from Aberdeen. We had in the 1980s in Aberdeen arguably the best club team in Europe at that point, winning the Cup Winners' Cup in 1983 and the Super Cup just a few months after that. And our manager at the time was a guy called Alex Ferguson, who most people in the football world have heard of, probably because of his exploits with Manchester United. But it's important to remember it all started for him at Aberdeen. So I was covering those games for Hospital Radio. I got my big chance when I was still a student at Aberdeen University in 1986. And I've been doing it professionally ever since then for a variety of broadcasters, initially for the BBC for 5 years, for ESPN for a big chunk of my career on and off. I'm now back doing things for ESPN with regard to the Bundesliga. I went back to the UK to work for ESPN's channel for a few years when they set that up in London, and then for a company called BT Sport, broadcasting the Champions League and Scottish football and the Bundesliga. And I continue to this day a relationship with the Bundesliga itself as one of the main voices of the world feed that is sent around the globe. And as you mentioned, I, since 2019, have been one of the voices on the FIFA game, the EA Sports FIFA game, which is a great honor and something that's very enjoyable to do. And as you'll know, FIFA 21 has just come out. So that's sort of the abbreviated version of my story.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we know some of those broadcasters in here like ESPN. Mr. Rae, how important has it been for you to talk another language? I know you are very fluent in German.
Yeah.
How important is it for a broadcaster, which in my experience, English speakers are not that good trying to learn another language, but you've taken it to the next level, speaking German and doing a great effort to call the names properly for players from everywhere. I've heard you calling the names in Spanish, and you do it in a great way too.
Well, thank you for that. That really means a lot to hear that, because I think you're right. I think as native English speakers, whether we're from the UK or from the USA or other countries for whom English is the first language, we're a bit lazy as a society, and we tend to think that other people should automatically speak English or do automatically speak English. And I know that English has become the world language, but I've never really viewed the world in that way. As I mentioned in my first answer to you, when I was first gripped by football in 1974 at the World Cup, watching that World Cup, it was in West Germany, and it spawned for me an interest in German culture and understand language. And so that's really where it started with me. I was a very curious child. And because of my location in Aberdeen, if you can imagine where Aberdeen is on the map, it's a coastal city on this small island in the northeastern part of Scotland. We have Denmark across the water. We have Norway just a bit north of us. We have the Netherlands and Germany if you were to travel down the North Sea. And as a child, I used to play around with our radio set, and I would listen to different languages and different countries being beamed into my life. And I think I was quite unusual. I don't think most of my friends did that or anything like that. But I used to feel that it brought another world into my life when I was learning German, especially. But I began to realize that because I could speak German, I could understand quite a lot of Dutch, because Dutch is a bit like a sort of a cross between English and German. And we would go to France occasionally on holiday. We went camping one year, and I later would learn French at school as well, but picked up some French just through traveling through France as a youngster. And as a young person, you do learn more easily. I think most people would tell you that if they learn a language at a young age, then it's likely to stick more readily than for an adult. And then it sort of kicked on from there. And I don't really speak Spanish. I've never learned Spanish, but because I was working at ESPN with so many Spanish speakers, and if you can imagine in the 90s when I first joined ESPN, they had their Latin American service newly up and running. And so I would have all my colleagues, from Argentina, from Costa Rica. We had a very nice guy called Randall Alvarez from Costa Rica, who is a friend of mine, and I would talk to him. And sometimes I would say to the guys, just let me speak in Spanish to you, because I learned how to sort of understand football Spanish, especially. I can read articles in Spanish or Costa Rican or Uruguayan or Argentinian newspapers and get the gist of what is being said, even though my level of Spanish is nowhere near my German, for example, as you heard from my initial answer, but I can understand quite a lot of it. And so it really comes down to that. I think football is a world game, and I think it's important to be curious about the world if you really want to know football. I've never viewed it through the prism of being somebody from Scotland or somebody from the United Kingdom or somebody who's lived in the USA for much of my life. I've viewed it as it's a common language that we have, that is football, but the language becomes more fluent if we can understand how somebody in another country talks about football. And for me, that's part of the fascination.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I've tried to learn myself as well. And yeah, I think it opens you a new world. Your first World Cup, 1990.
Yes.
Our first World Cup too. I know you called the game between Scotland and Costa Rica. When you saw that you were going to face Costa Rica, what did you know about your country?
Well, to be honest, on a football level, I knew very little. And I suspect that the Scottish national team at that time knew very little about Costa Rica. Obviously, I did my homework on the geography of the country and the people and its history, because I always do that. But you got to remember, in 1990, we didn't have the same access to information that we have 30 years on. And so it was a real challenge. I won't lie. It was a very difficult challenge. So what I did was, and my producer, I think, was very annoyed at me for insisting upon this. About, I'm going to say 4 or 5 days before the game, we were already in Italy, and we got word that Costa Rica were training in a location that was a good couple of hours away from Genoa, where we were based. And I said to the producer, I said, let's just jump in the car and go there and let's see what we can find. So we arrive at the training center, and it really wasn't much of a training center. It was really just a field, just a pitch. And of course, the coach was Bora Milutinovic, who I'm sure has legendary status in Costa Rica, as he does in many other countries. And just to digress a bit, I actually got to know Bora quite well in the years after that, because of course he was the coach of the USA. He worked in Major League Soccer for a while, and he and I actually had breakfast on a few occasions watching football matches when he was traveling around and I was traveling around, because I had a year covering his team in New York, or New Jersey, the Metro Stars as they were back then. But I digress. So I didn't know Bora at this point, but I managed to get him to do this very bad interview because his English at the time wasn't great, or I actually think his English was better than he pretended it was. But of course, he knew I was from Scotland. And, he didn't want to tell me too much. But then he had an assistant coach who did speak perfect English. He was actually from the Caribbean. And he told me everything I needed to know. It gave me a little bit of background on all the players. And, luckily I knew that, what conejo meant in English, and that was quite handy. But that was really where I got most of my information. And I do remember being slightly mocked by one or two colleagues who said, "Oh, you wasted a day doing that. What are you going to get out of that?" And I said, "Well, I never know what I'm going to get out of that. But what I do know is that if you fail to prepare, then prepare to fail." And of course, the story was written by Costa Rica that day in Genoa. And while I was there to cover the Scotland angle, and it wasn't a great angle to have to commentate on, I have to be honest, it was a difficult game from a Scottish point of view, the story ended up being Costa Rica. And I know to this day that victory is celebrated by ticos everywhere. So so there we have it. But Bora later became somebody who I would bump into regularly and even be in touch with by telephone from time to time. And he's a great guy. And he actually said to me, this is going to be around 1999, 2000. He said to me, "My friend," he always called me my friend. He said, "You are well connected in Scotland." He said, "Can you help me get the Scotland job? I would be very interested in being the Scotland manager. I think I could do something with that team." And he recounted the story of how when he arrived at the stadium with Costa Rica that day, he saw all the Scottish officials in their blazers, to his mind looking quite self-important. And he sort of thought to himself, this will be a real feather in my cap and Costa Rica's cap if we can do this. And he firmly believed with his game plan, which was not an ambitious game plan, but it was a very effective game plan, that they could beat Scotland. And the rest is history.
Before the game here in Costa Rica, people were saying that we're not going to get not even a corner kick. And then we won. But what did they say in Scotland after the game? Because, well, I would expect Scotland to win if Costa Rica at that time had never been in a World Cup or anything. How did you take it as a country?
Badly, not necessarily totally unexpectedly, because Scotland at that time had a habit of underperforming. I mean, we got to every World Cup in my early lifetime, 74, 78, 82, 86, and again 1990. So it was a continuous run, but we never managed to get out of the group. And this was a difficult group because obviously it had Brazil and a good, we thought, Swedish team at the time. So, I mean, nobody really thought Costa Rica were going to be in the running to get out of the group, but we knew about Scotland's history and Scotland's habit sometimes of playing down and not playing up to the right level. In 78, for example, we had Peru, Iran, and the Netherlands in our group, and we lost to Peru, we drew with Iran, and we beat the Netherlands, and that's sort of, at the time, that was a fairly typical Scottish cycle. And I suppose you can say 1990 was too, because we lost to Costa Rica, but then went and beat Sweden in the second game. And we were 7 or 8 minutes away from actually making it through, because it was 0-0 against Brazil, but then conceded a silly goal near the end of the game. And that was Scotland, and so typical of the Scottish story. But before the game, I think most people expected Scotland would win, but Scots are very superstitious and not always believing in their country. So I think the attitude after the game might have been, "Oh, well, here we go again," But if you look back at the game, it was not a good game. It was not a great game of football. Scotland had more chances, but they weren't great chances. And I remember Andy Roxburgh, the Scotland manager, afterwards describing it as a very unstructured game, which was sort of a new term to most of us at the time. But what he meant by that was that he thought, Scotland made most of the running and Costa Rica basically just defended. And that one goal by Juan Cayasso was the difference. And maybe that's true. Maybe there was an element of luck, but Scotland did not play well. And you've got to give Costa Rica credit for their part in writing that fabulous story.
Yeah, June 11th here is almost a holiday. We always remember it. Well, it was 30 years this year. And moving forward to a FIFA video game, one of those players is currently one of your partners in the game, who is Alan McInally. Can you tell us about this experience of working with EA? I know you started on FIFA 19 with the Champions League, because I know that's like your tournament. Tell us about it. How did they ask you to be part of the game, and how the process is to put the voice into one of the most played games in the world?
Well, the invitation came in 2017, and I had just left the UK to return to the USA to live. I'm talking to you now from the Boston area here in the USA. And I got an email sort of out of the blue from somebody who was connected with a video game company. He didn't say at that time which video game company and which video game. So it was all a little bit mysterious to begin with. And then it emerged a few days later, this would have been December 2017, that it was in fact the big one, EA Sports. And I met with them and I did an audition with them because they wanted to make sure that everything that I did would match with their game. Obviously, they had done their homework on me before they approached me in the first place. And it turned out that I was the guy they wanted to be the voice of the Champions League. Now, the thing is, at that time, they didn't firmly have the Champions League rights. And of course, the game wasn't out. The game doesn't come out until typically September of the following year. So this would have been for FIFA 19 coming out in 2018, the end of 2018. So I had to stay quiet about it all the while I was recording, but I couldn't tell anybody. And it really was top secret. So I couldn't tell, even close friends that I was doing it. Obviously, my wife knew I was doing it and my father knew I was doing it, but there weren't many others who I could really tell that I was doing this wonderful voiceover project as one of the commentators on the FIFA game. In terms of the actual process, it's very creative. It's quite challenging vocally, and you'll appreciate this. It takes a lot out of the voice if you're doing it properly, because you want to really put your heart and soul into it. And we tend to record, 20 to 25 days a year, not all at once, so there's a break between them. And essentially, there are differences between, fairly soft toned items, and then, the higher pitched, higher intensity things like goals, so we have to pace ourselves a bit because, as you can imagine, if we did, 2 hours of just, high energy goals, then, the voice might not last beyond the 2 hours. Because if you think about it in the context of a normal game, then you might get up for that moment once or twice in a game. But here with the recording, we're having to do that, many times over in a row. So we just all work together. I have a great producer and I have a great sound man, and they know the game intimately, and we just all work as a team. And of course, Lee Dixon, my co-commentator, he does his part of the game as well. And, on we go from there. And then it all comes together. I never know how it's really going to sound until the game comes out, because, of course, I don't have control over, items of commentary that I recorded. I don't have control over when they are used in the game. But it's, it's really something that's become a huge part of my life. And, I don't take it for granted. I just enjoy it. And, here we are 3 years later, still doing it.
Yeah, and that's great. That's how I met you. I didn't know you before because, well, we live here in Costa Rica, so we don't have access
Yeah.
to the broadcasts in English. Calling the names, I know this is a very important part of the game for you. I see you on Twitter sharing the link with the YouTube video for Bruno Fernandes. How is the process of calling the names properly?
Well, it goes back to my commentary on TV, and I've always done it this way. I've always tried to be authentic with pronunciations. Now, I'm not pretending that I've had it 100% right in every single game that I've done down the years. But what I can say to you is that the 100% effort has been in place. And sometimes with some countries, there are 2 or 3 different ways to say a name within that country, as you know. And if you get into the Spanish-speaking world, you can have debates about whether, if it's an Argentinian player, well, you should, the double L in Argentina is that je sound, Magallanes, as opposed to Magallanes, as you might say in Costa Rica, or in Spain, the th sound, for a C sound, Garcia instead of Garcia. But essentially, I go into it and I try to be authentic. And my sort of ground rule is that if the player is playing the game, or if his family members are playing the game, I really want them to say, oh, that commentator is actually saying our name the way we say our name. That is my goal. And listen, it's difficult. There are some languages that are quite hard to reproduce the sounds of. I'm thinking of, Chinese, for example. Chinese or Mandarin, very difficult because those sounds are unique to that language. Even German, if you're not a German speaker, it's quite hard for a lot of people to reproduce the German sounds. I'm thinking of the R that comes from the back of the throat. It's quite a distinctive sound in German. The sound that, most people don't make in other languages. I think in Spanish, you can come close to that with the J sound, like Jose. It's not too far away from that. But, in England, for example, they can't make that sound, or they don't roll their R's, the R's are like that. So it's, it really depends how you want to come at it. I just feel that I want to be me on this game, and I want to be true to the players. And you mentioned the clip I've been putting up a lot is that of Bruno Fernandes, because he's Portuguese. He's not Spanish. He's not Costa Rican. He's not Argentinian. He's Portuguese. And if you listen to him saying his own name, it's Bruno Fernandes. But I think this is where, if I can say it, I think the fact that Spanish is now a world language makes people default to Spanish for a lot of names, thinking that is the way that names ought to be said. And I'll be honest with you, it would make my life a lot easier if I just went with everybody else and just called names as other people call them, whether they're right or wrong. But the linguist in me will not let me do that. And so I'm willing to have people. And listen, social media is not reality. I think we always have to remember that. Social media is a few quite loud people who like to express themselves. It's not necessarily reflective of society as a whole, maybe a loud, opinionated part of society. But I would just rather get it right, Jose. That's my, that's my feeling going into any broadcasting project, that I want to get it right. And I'll take the stick if somebody who doesn't know languages wants to try to correct me on linguistic matters. Then good luck to them. I wouldn't be in the business of going to try to tell an epidemiologist or an economist that they know nothing about epidemiology or economics. So to me, it's the same principle. If you want to do that, good luck. If you have a linguistic background, I'll listen to you. But if you don't, then fine, say what you want to say.
Yeah, someone that really tries to get the names right as myself. I really appreciate it. Mr. Rae, thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I have no words.
No, well, listen, thank you for the invitation. And maybe I could just finish by saying that I suppose I'm a very good luck charm for Costa Rica, because I didn't cover Costa Rica after that game in 1990 until the 2014 World Cup, when I was on site for ESPN covering their match against Italy. And you remember what happened in that game as well. So I bumped into a few Costa Rican journalists, and we were just chatting, and we brought up the subject of 1990. And I said, well, here we are. I've done 2 Costa Rica matches in 2 different World Cups, 24 years apart. And the record is 1-2, drawn none, lost none. So,
well, I hope you call our games on the 2022 World Cup. Well, I hope to hear you there. Mr. Rae, thank you. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks again.